So I went to the region and met with, for many, many hours, I met with a whole series of Hamas officials on a range of subjects. We discussed the most recent terms that were put in front of Hamas. And just to share a bit of detail about this, Sharif, what I was told, and there had been some reporting about this, but there were denials and allegations, etc., about the role of Egypt. What I was told is that the Egyptians and the Qataris are the two main regional mediators, although you have some involvement of the Emiratis and the Turks on the kind of periphery of this, and of course you have the United States, but that the Egyptians have increasingly been putting pressure on Hamas to offer concessions that fall far outside of the original January framework that Hamas agreed to. And that Hamas was disturbed when Egypt started presenting this demand from Israel of disarmament. Now, they didn't say this was an Egyptian demand or that the Egyptians were saying, you must accept this. But Hamas said that they felt it was off, that Egypt seemed to be relaying this in a kind of direct way that was not appropriate for a mediator. And what's interesting about that, I asked, what's the difference between Egypt and Qatar in this dynamic? And it was quite interesting. We don't often examine these dynamics, but what the position or the perspective of Hamas is that Egypt, because it borders Gaza and because it is so close to Israel, has a different set of interests geopolitically than Qatar. So Egypt, as one Hamas official said, the deep state of Egypt has an interest in Hamas continuing to exist in Gaza, but in a dramatically weakened form, so that it can pose some form of a threat to keep the tensions high with Israel and keep Egypt relevant in the equation beyond the obvious, but as a strategic, necessary entity that will have to constantly deal with the aftershocks of what Israel does in Gaza. But also that Egypt has its own history with the Muslim Brotherhood. The last time there were true democratic elections in Egypt, Mohammed Morsi was democratically elected. Mohammed Morsi comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. It's not directly the Muslim Brotherhood in this, in the Egyptian context, but they come from the same political origin. And so you have a complicated game that the dictator of Egypt, Sisi, is playing, the second largest recipient of US military aid, second only to Israel. So Egypt's perspective on this is not simply, we want to find a way to end the genocide. Egypt has its own geopolitical interests that are not actually about the fate of the Palestinian people for the sake of saving them or defending their right to self-determination. So when Egypt is perceived by Hamas to kind of, they didn't say doing Israel's bidding, but seemed to be pushing Hamas to drop the legitimacy of the original ceasefire deal, Hamas basically started to say, you know what, we're going to draw a line in the sand on this. And we're no longer going to engage in any agreement. And they said this to me on the record and on background. There will be no more short-term truces that do not include an irrevocable path to an end of the Israeli occupation of Gaza, the full withdrawal of Israeli forces, and an end to the genocide. Now, Hamas is saying, our preference is we go back to the January framework and we resume the second phase. During that second phase, the Israelis were supposed to be completely withdrawing and the captives were going to be exchanged. Or an alternative arrangement, perhaps with some concessions here and there, that also leads to the same path of Israeli withdrawal, an end to the genocide, a full exchange of captives. So Hamas is saying, we're done. You asked about the recent, we have the recent Operation, Gideon's Chariot that has been leaked in the Israeli media, which is this plan to conquer and hold all of these sections throughout Gaza, and then forcing Palestinians into an increasingly small area in the south, and that Israel would remain there indefinitely. Hamas is saying, we are not going to lay down our weapons or agree to any disarmament in any form until there's a path to a Palestinian state. I asked them about media reports that Hamas was contemplating temporarily storing its weapons under some kind of neutral third party or handing them over as a gesture of kind of good faith. And they said, this is a complete concoction in the media. This has never even been formally raised with Hamas. It just goes to show you how inaccurate and wild some of the reporting is. They're saying this has never been raised formally. And is Israel going to store its weapons during this period? That's what Hamas is saying. Who's going to go to Israel and say, you have to put your weapons up? Because history, according to Hamas, has shown that when the Palestinians do surrender their weapons, it's followed by more Israeli massacres. And we are now in the most intense phase of a 76-year Nakba, the intention of which is to annihilate the Palestinian people from their land. So their perspective is, we're done with these games. We're done, from their perspective, of trying to be reasonable and constantly being asked to make concessions, because we're getting to a point where those concessions call into question the very existence of the Palestinian people in Gaza.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially when you're talking about Egypt. What I found, some of his comments, some of the most interesting comments he gave, that he said he was astonished that Egypt was bringing this proposal to them as a mediator, because Egypt should have known that Hamas would reject this, would reject a call for complete demilitarization, essentially a call to surrender. And they should have told the Israelis that. And he gave a very interesting example and said, okay, if Hamas told Egypt to propose to the Israelis that Netanyahu needs to step down and they need to hand over Tel Aviv to the Palestinians, would Egypt even consider this proposal? Of course not. They would tell Hamas, no, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. But so Egypt does appear to be pressuring Hamas to kind of accept these new terms. And I can say that for many years, Egypt's essentially been a very strong ally to Israel. They helped to enforce the blockade on Gaza since 2006. They eventually destroyed the tunnels that provided a lifeline to Gaza. They coordinated with Israel on security. They allow Israeli drones and helicopters and warplanes to carry out covert air campaigns in Sinai. And Egypt's treatment of Palestinians coming from Gaza is notorious for its indignity. And most recently, up until they had control of the Philadelphia corridor, up until last year when Israel invaded Rafah in May, just over a year ago, Palestinians were able to leave Gaza through Rafah with security clearance. In order to get that security clearance, Egyptian intelligence was part of this extortion network that essentially was charging Palestinians thousands of dollars per person in order to leave Gaza. And so, but at the same time, they do have this very deep connection to Gaza. Egypt also administered Gaza up until 1967. Egyptian intelligence does have very strong ties to Hamas, real connections. They helped broker the ceasefire in 2021 and were very effective in doing that. And they want to have a stake in the game going forward.